You said that oh no.
We're not
Oh well,
recording.
we'll just dive straight into it.
We'll just keep going.
So
Yeah.
we'll keep going. We just had a big, amazing discussion, right? But we're basically now talking about how non-duality fits into therapy, and how there's a distinction between a big self and a small self. Big self being the non-dual self, small self being the self which we talked about right here. And then we talked about the different classes of shadow, which I'll talk about later, and how there are different ways to heal them. But right now, what we're talking about is how everything in reality is constructed and how to play around with that, right? How to play around with that when it comes to healing from trauma, healing from shadow, and how can we even tell what is shadow to heal, what's real, what's authentic, what's not, right? So if I pick up where I left off, which is around constructed, the mind, how the mind is constructed. If everything is constructed, right? If we're living in this construct of a human being and everything is empty and everything is meaningless, that also means that shadows and trauma is emptiness and it's empty and meaningless too. So why the hell are we doing shadow work and hypnotherapy, Aaron, right? Well, the reason why is because even though those constructs are empty, we're still living in those constructs. There has to be a construct at some point. No, there has to always be a construct. Otherwise, you would cease to exist, right? So if there always has to be a construct, why would we not make the best, most amazing construct that there is, right? Why would we not do that? And that includes getting rid of the old faulty constructs and constructing new beautiful ones that are truly authentic and that can arise from a place of deep awareness rather than from the mind level, which is where all those fears exist as well, you know? And that's how you can kind of think about this stuff. It's like literally transforming your reality. Your reality is literally being transformed. You're literally stepping into another reality. Like one of the clients I just worked with yesterday, French guy, he's been struggling with this trauma around his dad for a long time, right? And it was around giving power to his dad, and he realized that he thought he had to be powerless because not because that's just how it was, but because he wasn't in control of his own life. He had a deep belief that he was not in control of his own life, right? So no wonder a lot of this stuff wasn't clicking for him, because he believed that this wasn't possible for him. Everything was happening outside of him, right? And as soon as we healed that and he stepped back into himself, the idea of his old reality was ridiculous. So ridiculous that he couldn't even imagine stepping into a new one, right? So let me break that down even more. What's even more crazy about that? The reality that you're living in right now, something that's bothering you so much, if you just step into something new, that will become so alien to you. It's almost like looking at someone else living a different life, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I could say that a lot of Buddhist practices or attachment practices focus on that, right? They focus on detangling yourself from the thing that you thought was you.
Yeah.
So how does that relate to shadow work? The idea of stopping the craving, stopping the attachment or removing the attachment. You mentioned before that it's slightly different to the process of shadow work, because the process of shadow work involves, oh, I guess the process of having non-attachment doesn't necessarily mean you don't have any shadows.
Yeah, because they're two separate processes. There's the cleaning up, which is shadow work, and hypnotherapy or therapy, right? And there's the waking up, which is the spiritual practice. That can be Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, whatever you want to do. They all have their mystical traditions, right? So yeah, just because you're very well spiritually well developed doesn't mean that you're also not going to have shadows and you're not going to live through those shadows. I always use the example, but Osho is a perfect example of that, right? Completely bypassed finances and money and left it to someone else to figure that out while he was doing like a silent retreat basically on his own, which led to like the collapse of everything basically, right? Completely disowned the reality that he was in, but he knew that there was, the American government was not happy with it, and that, you know, this person that he gave all of the financial responsibility to wasn't very well developed, right? But he couldn't see that because he hadn't done the developmental work and he hadn't done the trauma work, right? Doesn't mean that he wasn't incredibly spiritually gifted, because he was, right? So there's that, and then it's all at the end of the day, how you can categorize it is it's all going towards the end of suffering, right? All going towards the end of suffering. And one of the cool things about this is, so when you're making a new belief, or no, you're not making a new belief, when you've healed an old belief, an old narrative, there's a space that's left over, right? Now, we're not doing what so many other therapies do, which is we try and fill that space, right? Try and goes from, oh, I don't feel like I'm enough to I am enough. Saying I am enough is just as ridiculous as saying I'm not enough. Why? Because how could you ever not be enough? Why do you have to say it? The example I give is this. It would be like me going around and every color I see having to point out that color and make sure that everyone else agrees. That's blue, right? That's brown. That's green, right? People are like, bro, we just know, right? It's the same thing. If you have struggles with low self-esteem, the solution is not to believe that I am enough. The solution is to get rid of anything that says that you're not enough, and then you just are, if that makes sense. Because anything more than that is so flimsy. It's so constructed. It's from the linguistic mind. It's not very deep, right? Which is why you let that space be there, and then with awareness and unconditional love, you observe that space, you sit in that space, and you allow a new meaning, a new understanding to build from the ground up, from like a visceral identity level, atomic level to build up. Not anything, you're not going top down, you're going from the bottom up by sitting in awareness, right? That's where the awareness stuff comes back in, right? There's ego-based systems, belief-based systems, sport-based systems, awareness-based systems. We want that to come from an awareness, right? So that's part of something which is called an embodiment practice, which is obviously part of the coaching that I do and my peers do, which is after the belief is gone, the old belief is gone. There's an embodiment practice, a very structured embodiment practice that the client goes through in order to cement, to make sure that doesn't come back, and to make sure that something new can emerge that's actually truly aligned and authentic, right? Are you following so far? Or am I
Yeah, I'm following. Yeah. I do want to challenge you in one point though, which is the direction. So removing everything and then sort of the true self emerges. You automatically line back into wholeness and fullness and being in your best state. Feeling enough, for example, which I definitely agree with. But I'm challenging it on the point of that the other side doesn't work. And I've thought about this for a while. And originally I was in the same camp that you kind of fit in right now, but people like, for example, Dr. Joe Dispenza talk about how you can he basically says don't even really focus on the old self, the negative, the situation, the trauma, and just to move into the new energy and just shift yourself into that new energy, and automatically everything that's going to come up is going to come up and it's going to be released sort of on its own. So coming from that standpoint, just attuning yourself so strongly to the positive, to the for example, I am enough, until the I am not enough sort of dissipates, because anything that challenges that I am enough will have to be confronted, will have to be looked at, will have to be examined, because you need to hold that state. Everything that is in that state will automatically unravel and kind of disappear. So what are your thoughts on that sort of approach?
I would say, so symbolically it's great, right? And symbolically, and it's actually the same practice, right? He's like saying you can use a line, I am enough, to anchor that new state, that new embodiment. From this camp, it's like, oh, you just be in the space where that used to be with unconditional love and awareness, and you're anchoring it that way, right? For some people, that works great, like saying it in your mind. For other people, it can create craving, in my experience, right? Where they crave that new reality so much that it just creates a whole new line of craving, right? And like all these other things, these like not what's the word? Not justifications, not
Rationalizations.
checklists, not rationalizations. It's like all of these criteria to be enough because of that because they're craving that, like, oh, I am enough, like that, right? Almost like that kind of thing. And but symbolically, if you want to look at it that way, it's fine if you have like an anchor, if that's like really easy for you to do and you can hold that state and it's not something that's a big deal to you, and it's just something that you can hold and be in, and it has a lot of meaning to you, right? But anything other than that, I think it's a little bit like I would say you want to make it, and people are welcome to disagree with me. You want to make it as clean as possible. And for me, the cleanest way to do it without having your own impression on it is just to be in that empty space where something used to be, right? Because otherwise you risk diluting it and polluting it, which can happen with some people. On the other hand, to disagree with me, myself, some people are not at the developmental stage where that's like super easy for them to do, to like be in awareness or be in that space that's left over, right? So in that case, don't let the good be the enemy of the great. You can use a little mantra if you want to, right? To be like, oh, I am enough to help anchor that. But at some point, I would say that that practice would have to be let go, because you get because eventually you'll get to such a state where words are just so meaningless that you're like, bro, this I am enough doesn't even mean anything to me, because that is also just a construct which is completely empty and meaningless and is impermanent and has no self, right?
Yeah, going into that.
And then go. I was just gonna say, and then it's just the state that's left. That's the only thing that's left over, you know?
Yeah, going into that idea of how different modalities might be useful to us at different times. This has definitely been true for me, following different teachers and different guidance, and sometimes was very necessary. And then looking back on it, it doesn't resonate anymore. And so there's something that's changing here, where the mind is able to attune to certain teachers at times and not at other times as we develop. How does the stages model understand this process?
It can be a few different things. First one is just that for whatever reason, there was like maybe a part of you that really needed to hear whatever stage the spiritual teacher was at. And now that it's kind of got what it needed and it's matured enough and it's embodied that stage healthily, it can move on. Another one is that your actual main cognition has shifted up a level and their stuff no longer resonates with you because it's seen as very, like it's hard to get coached by someone that isn't at least at the same developmental perspective as you know, no matter how profound their spiritual insights are, it will still be said through the lens of whatever their spiral dynamics are, which is which is their value system, and their ego development, which is the structure of their ego. It will be communicated through that, and in the stages model, which is the combination of the two, right? More or less, basically. So it can be like that too, or it can be like maybe a shadow got healed, and maybe this teacher or whatever was appealing to that shadow, and now that shadow is no longer there. There's nothing left to appeal to, right? So that it can be any of those, and there can be a few other ones which I can't think of right now, but those are the main kind of things that come to mind, right? That kind of resonate with you and your journey.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
For example, you may have gone through this stage as well, but resonating with Jordan Peterson type people,
Yeah.
Or early self-development trainings, David Goggins at some stage.
Yeah. Yeah.
And depending on what exactly you're working on, I find that there is something to learn from each of them. There is something
Yeah.
that we are very good at that
Mm-hmm.
teachers maybe up the stages aren't so
Yeah.
good at. Like David Goggins definitely has a strong shadow,
Yeah.
but you can't doubt that he's one of the greatest in the world at like just pushing himself to do things, right? So there's
Yeah.
something to
Yeah.
learn there that's like really beautiful.
Mm.
So what I found is, because I've read his book like three, maybe four times now,
Oh
and
wow.
as I develop and as I reread it, or re-listen to it on audio, I see a different perspective, and the shadow aspects aren't so they're not taking it on.
Yeah.
Like before, I might have taken on like a lot of the I need to just really work hard and push myself and
Hmm.
all of that stuff. And like that's the only way. I just need to grind myself out. But I
Hmm.
think as you develop, you can look at his perspective and you could say,
Yeah.
okay, what's the good here? What can I extract? And what parts maybe his shadow that I don't have to resonate
Yeah,
with?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. That's why healing shadow is so important, because it gives you access to so many different pools without taking on interactions from them or projecting onto them. So you actually get like a really raw, unfiltered, like wisdom that you can draw from anywhere, because you're not getting triggered by it. It's like taking things very cleanly. It's like eating clean, you know? Like if I take anabolics and eat a bunch of fried chicken, like yeah, it's gonna get me gained or whatever, and it's gonna get me fast gains, but at some point my health is also being contaminated at the same time. Whereas I just eat like enough protein, the right amount of calories, work out 4 to 5 times a day, do the right amount of cardio. My gains are going to be much slower, but over time, my health is going to increase and not decrease. Right? It's the same thing. It's like one is like a contaminated way of learning, and the other one is a much cleaner way of learning. Right? Let's say if like you were listening to me right now and I was like triggering something in your childhood, then like quality of information you'll be able to take from this conversation will be very different than what it is right now. Right? Same
Mm.
way as if I was delivering information to you and there was something about you that reminded me of like a childhood bully or something like that. Suddenly I'm not able to communicate in the same way. And I might be in some struggle, some subtle like power dynamic with you, which you're not even aware of, and I'm the only one that's playing, right?
Mm.
So it's about it becoming cleaner as well.
So do you think there is a more clean or more right way to do shadow work? And if so, how does one go about doing shadow work in a more clean fashion?
Mm. So first of all, you want to make sure your your shadow work teacher or mentor or coach is at least at fourth person perspective, at least, right? That way they can understand culture, right? And how cultures are shaped and culture shape you, and how there's and because that's also a lot how shadow is developed as well, and how like your parents and your family can kind of shape you as well, right? For someone who's at that level, you want to be with someone who doesn't just do one thing, but is well versed in the spiritual side of things, the developmental psychology side of things, preferably like the neuroscience and cognitive science side of things, something which I'm slacking on a little bit. And then obviously has to be a good practitioner as well, right? Not because any of that stuff actually really affects how good you are as a practitioner in terms of like the actual one-on-one coaching work. Actually, I'll walk that back a bit. It does, but not like that's like the 20%. The 80% is the other is like the actual like how good you are on calls, your experience, what to kind of look for in the modality, right? But that stuff is the other 20% auxiliary. But the reason why that stuff is so important is so they're not leading you off of a cliff, basically, right? Can you imagine if you took like, let's say like David Goggins was a therapist back when we were like really into him, right? Where you are right now, he would have like driven you off of the cliff, if you just followed his advice, because he's only at like one stage of the path, you know. So you want to make sure they're not going to drive you off the cliff, and then they don't have any like big blind spots in terms of the spiritual stuff and the therapy stuff and the developmental psychology stuff, because otherwise you can learn to go into spiritual narcissism. You can go into like therapists thinking that they're like God, you know, that kind of stuff, and like being quite manipulative, which I've heard about, but luckily I don't know anyone that's like that. Otherwise, I just call them out right now. Um, yeah, you want to have all of those things, and then third of all, you want to make sure the actual therapy modality itself covers all the bases. Doesn't just have one set of techniques that it uses. Uses integration techniques, uses reowning techniques, and uses letting go techniques, not just one. Because we talked about, I mean, earlier in the podcast that wasn't filmed, we talked about the dangers of integrating and interject. And interject is a meaning that's given to you from the outside world that you've taken on. Example I use is, let's say your mum that didn't hug you when you were a child, and it's a really core memory burned into you, the time that you wanted to go hug your mum, and she was just like, no. And that meaning came up, like, I'm not deserving of love. That was a meaning that wasn't there authentically. It happened because of that external thing, the relationship with your mum, right? Now, if you were to use a reintegration technique on that, oh, that's an inner child, love that inner child, bring it into your heart, hug it. Suddenly, you just integrated an inauthentic part of yourself even deeper into your psychology and your psyche. And that means that it becomes way more problematic and way more, because it's way more entangled within you. You know, it's sometimes suddenly it's not enough now to see it as inauthentic and just let it go, because now it feels like it's a part of you, right? That's the danger of integrating something that's not a part of you. And then it's also really dangerous to try and let go of an authentic part of you that's just wounded, right? Like an actual inner child of you. It's like abandoning an actual child, right? Like, oh yeah, just let that go. David R. Hawkins, just let that go. I don't think that's what he was saying, but that's how it kind of got written in the mainstream. So you got to make sure they understand those distinctions. Otherwise, a lot of them will do more harm than good.
Yeah, I've definitely followed a lot of letting go type stuff and fit in the category of like just let it go, just let it go.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm really curious about like where that falls away and where it actually works well. As far as their inner teachings go, because I feel like they surely would have encountered difficulties in their teaching or their students, if they didn't have a well-rounded perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you're creating your own culture, it becomes very easy to create echo chambers. So I think that's where it kind of comes into, actually, to be honest. I mean, you've been to enough like events and like been in enough kind of communities like I have to realize how much of echo chambers there really are. And if they're not healthy, how much like the teachers just turn into gurus, basically, whether that's with pickup or whether that's with tantra, whether that's with men's groups or whether that's with whatever, right? If the therapy hasn't been done, that's what kind of happens, you know. So that's what I would kind of say. And also, in all fairness, like we all build on each other. So 50 years from now, there's going to be an even more integrative and holistic way to approach all of this than what I'm talking about, right? It's just that we haven't found it yet, right? And for them, like David L. Hawkins, like, listen, 70% of all problems are interjections from what I've experienced, right? So like, that's a pretty good hit ratio, you know, letting go of all that kind of stuff. It's just that like 30 to 20% is like and I'm just throwing out numbers, is like a pretty significant margin of error as well at the same time, right? But also before that, there wasn't that much stuff for him to go off of, you know? So it's also taking that into account.
Yeah, right. And one final topic before we end. I wanted to touch on dating and shadow work and how you can use shadow work in dating when you get triggered. Perhaps you go on a date and they don't respond or you get ghosted, which is a very common occurrence, right? And this can trigger emotions in you. This can maybe trigger some wounding or desire for approval. Maybe it can trigger that sort of what we call anxious attachment wounding. You might have, not desiring to be rejected, afraid of rejection, things like that. So as these come up, sort of what are a practice that somebody could do to work on these?
So first of all, you want to go trigger hunting, right? You want to go looking for the specific triggers that lead to this reaction, right? To play this example, we use ghosting. You just went on a date, you thought it went well, don't get a text back, right? Get ghosted. Okay, specific trigger there. Now we can start investigating. Okay, what is it about this trigger, me getting ghosted, which is causing me to feel bad? In other words, what's happening up here that's causing that to happen, right? Because not everyone that gets ghosted feels really bad about themselves. They might be annoyed, but they're not going to like beat themselves up about it. So what is it about my mind that's making that into that outcome? Mental process aware. Oh, well, it's because it just makes me feel like I'm not wanted. Okay. Now we can go a little bit deeper and expand that and get a bit more specific. Okay, well, what is it about that makes you feel like you're not wanted? Well, it's because it just reminds me of getting abandoned by my mom. Right? So okay. So what happened with your mom? She was just never available for me. Right? Okay. And then you go even deeper and you ask yourself, well, what's the meaning of this? What meaning did I create for myself out of the fact that my mom was never there for me? It created the meaning that I am not worthy to be loved. So now every time that I get ghosted, that just reinforces that. Now you've got to the core wound. And then core wound, you have to identify whether that's an introject projection or split ego state. And depending on which one it is, in this case, it's an introject. You would give that back to your mother and to your childhood. Yeah, that meaning isn't actually something that I created. It's actually something that I created from that. And whilst this event happens, that meaning has nothing to do with whether or not I'm worthy of love. I can just give that back, right? Obviously, that's what I would cover in like a therapy session or whatever, right? That's like the general process of it. In terms of like a quick tips or anything like that, there's not really anything that you can say, to be honest, because it's happening at such a deep unconscious level, especially when it's something around dating, because that's like for whatever reason, it's very visible for a lot of guys. Because I think it's just very triggering for a guy because it's such like a part of life. If you can't get a relationship or have sex or whatever, it's like feels like such a failure on like just as a man, right? So when it comes to stuff like that, most likely it'll be very triggering. So you kind of have to have someone there facilitating it. But that's the general rule. If you follow that principle, you'll be able to get a lot of really good insights and value from that to see how stuff is working in your mind. Because when you have illumination, everything is possible. When you have illumination, everything is possible.
So what if you don't get to the core wound? What if you have something that comes up, you get triggered, you let it go? David R. Hawkins style. You don't get to the core wound. Now you might get triggered again, you might let it go. You might get triggered again, you might let it go. Does that eventually get you to the same place as if you went straight down vertically to the core wound, identified it, became conscious of it, and then properly let go or integrated that core wound?
Well, there's obviously no hard and fast rule because it's like the unconscious. But I would argue with the David R. Hawkins, it's just 90% of the time you just be going in a circle. Maybe like lucky 5% of the time you could get to the core wound that way and release it. But if you never get to the core wound, it will just keep on coming up again. Even if you heal it at the mental process level, it's still not enough because yes, that specific mental construct might be no longer there, but because that core wound is still there, it will just create another one. Might take a while, it might take a couple of months, but it'll create another one, you know? So like the one of just letting it go is like a circle, whereas this one is like you just dive in and then you come back out. And the circle is like just about to get to it and then comes back up. Just about to get to it and comes back up, right? Like that, basically. That's what I would say. Unless you just kind of get lucky, which can happen.
Okay. So let's say somebody's identified the core wound and they're going through different scenarios, it's coming back up, and they have, I guess, put some time into processing that core wound. Now, this core wound might still be there. There still might be remnants that are there.
Mhm.
You have another situation, you get triggered again,
Mhm.
it comes back up.
Yeah.
Now, what is the, I guess, sort of timeline somebody should expect? Because people might feel like, oh, it should be healed instantly, or if it gets re-triggered, they
Mhm.
might
Mhm.
be, I'm back where I
Yeah.
started. I've made no
Yeah.
progress, especially if it
Yeah.
feels like,
Yeah.
quite strong and visceral and, even somatic in your body.
Yeah. Yeah.
You might have doubting feelings. Maybe you don't have the experience to see that, it could go through
Yeah.
stages. It's not a vertical line into healing. And so what's
Mhm.
sort of the time frame, or should somebody have an expectation? How should somebody kind of relate to this process
Mhm.
of healing? Yeah.
It's kind of like asking. Like I know you're not the one asking that, but it's kind of like asking, like, how long is a piece of string? You know, like when you've done this internal work, like I have and like Dylan has, you can have like massive breakthroughs where like decades are just rewired like that, right? And then other times it can take a while, right? In terms of the actual embodiment practice, it takes 4 to 8 weeks to fully embody that, just to really give it enough time for something new to flourish. And if someone is experiencing that, like, oh, I made no progress, I'd actually argue that is the thing that's holding them back, most likely, right? This idea of like progress and having to make progress and like really needing like certainty to make something work and that kind of thing, right? I would actually, if they were my client, I'd look into that and be like, okay, where's that coming from? Because there's all this, because what that is pressure. And when there's pressure, most likely there's an interject, right? So that's another thing. These interjects or these core wounds can like sometimes build off of each other. Sometimes they're not. And sometimes you just get straight to the one that's all the core wounds are on. But other times they're like kind of like a house of cards, right? How like you would have made so much progress here, but you have this one which is like, oh, if I'm not making constant progress, I'm a failure. And that has to be dealt with, right? So it's kind of like that, basically. So what you can expect is no expectations, and a core wound can be healed within one session, or it could be healed within 10 or 100, right? Also depends on what the work that the client has done, what kind of framework and modalities they bought into, basically. Like whether they've done healing work which has messed them up, or whether they've just done spiritual bypassing for like 10 years, right? Also depends on their journey. If they're coming in completely fresh slate, that's great, you know? Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So
Yeah,
numbness and dissociation, these are potential barriers to figuring out or
yeah,
feeling, right?
yeah,
So as a therapist, when somebody and a new client or maybe a friend is dealing with some numbness and dissociation, and when you're numb, you don't know you're numb, right? When you're
yeah.
dissociated, you don't know you're dissociated. When you aren't grounded,
Mhm,
you don't know you aren't grounded.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
so as a therapist, how do you help to align that person
mhm.
into that therapy model? How do you help?
Yeah,
Um,
great question.
yeah.
So there's like 7 different modalities of therapy: somatic, symbolic, cognitive behavioral, systems therapy, which is like IFS, which is like a systematic therapy. And then there's 2 others which I can't remember right now, or they're crossing my mind, right? So it's kind of your job as a therapist to identify which one the client works the best with, and just go with that, basically, right? And just do the best that you can, because also sometimes our client just needs to sit and feel their numbness for a few sessions before it suddenly starts to break down. You know, that's what we mean by like, how long is a piece of string, right? Now that shouldn't be used as an excuse for like a therapist to just sit on their ass and like not do anything for a few sessions. But sometimes that's all that can be done, right? That's
Mhm.
why you also never want to get into a situation where like a therapist is trying to hard sell you, because they can't guarantee anything. And if they do, then they create expectations, which just messes up the therapy within itself, you know?
Yeah.
Right?
I've definitely
Yeah,
been on the receiving side of that, and have met coaches that
yeah,
take me through a slide deck of testimonials and things like that.
yeah,
Now, how as a therapist, or maybe any sort of practitioner that wants to help people, how can you navigate that world and remain authentic, remain in a place where you aren't creating false
yeah.
expectations, still um, selling, delivering value,
Hmm.
and getting buy-in from potential
Hmm. Hmm.
clients? How
Most
have you
likely,
done that?
there's a split ego state there of like thinking that those things can't exist at the same time when they can. You can 100% be 100% certain in your product whilst not like giving any crazy guarantees. You can 100% be selling without like being pushy about it, right? Those things are not mutually exclusive. You can 100% be putting yourself out there whilst not, yeah, like being sleazy or any of that kind of stuff. It's more about a conviction within yourself and just doing all the right, and then also integrating strategy, reintegrating the right kind of strategy and doing the right tasks, and having, yeah, it's about having a conviction within yourself and being fully aligned, all your split ego states being fully aligned, basically, because you can be all of those things at the same time. Luckily,
So, is there somebody that you followed to learn this through, or have you followed or learned from many different people and sort of integrated your own approach from stages and just your own internal shadow work and becoming more mature? You've figured it out
so
yourself.
obviously there's my big main mentor, Pierre de Souza. My other big one, Sister Conte Kema. My other big one, Kim Barter. And then before that, I learned from Scott Jansen and James Tripp, hypnotherapy. And before that, I learned from Freddie Jacquin and Anthony Jacquin, hypnotherapy. And I learned some provocational coaching. And in terms, and what else am I thinking of? And those are the main kind of teachers. It's kind of an amalgamation of everything there, basically. Yeah. And then you got to find your own way as well.
Yeah, cool. So often we see courses and they sell you on, hey, these are the right belief systems, this is the
Yeah.
right mindset, this is,
Yeah.
hey, I have the secret piece of paper. And if you purchase this course, I'll teach you all these things. And
Hmm.
now you have the same mental model that I have. You'll be successful. That's
Hmm.
sort of the way a lot of people sell.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, how can that approach be beneficial, or how can it be
Yeah.
disastrous? What are your thoughts on that?
It's beneficial, more benefit. The reason why that works on a wider scale is because the market just rewards that, because the market is the culture in general, and the culture in general is less developed than maybe individuals, right? Because it's like a mix of everyone. So actually, when you're in the concrete tier, or you're in like the lower subtle tier, like 3.0, it can actually be really useful to have like concrete guidelines and concrete beliefs and be like, this is what I believe, and this is what I'm going to follow. Because before you get to 4.0, the ability to really be intimate and authentic with yourself is almost like, is very hard, because you don't have that perspective yet. You don't have access to it because you can't see how cultures have shaped you and developed you. You're not living in that effortlessly, right? So it works up to a point, but then the problem is you have to let go of that at some point to move to the next stage, because the thing you have to let go of is the fact that those things were also not yours. They're kind of introductions, but just not in like a bad way, right? Although they can cause introductions, but you need to come with like your own kind of, at some point that has to be let go of to move into something that's actually yours. And also when you do that, everything becomes much more smoother and much more aligned, and it doesn't have as much resistance to things, because it's you. It's coming from you and what you want. Even if it doesn't work straight away, that thing, because it's authentically you, there's just so much less stress.
Mm, yeah,
And you get to fail authentically, you know?
yeah, that's beautiful. And I think that's what we may be seeing now as society moves up in the stages, and
Yeah.
as people resonate less with, or they see the pitfalls of a lot of traditional self-improvement and self-development content, for moving into more that authentic questioning space of what works for me and what can I learn from people, and also remain true to myself and
Mhm.
not take on all the
Yeah.
negative belief systems that people also
Yeah.
do hold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. It's having that emotional boundary because they're projecting that onto you, and you take that as an interjection, right? If that it's just if that thing was to happen. So it's about being grounded within yourself, having those emotional boundaries, and having emotional boundaries is not like pushing that onto other people. It's knowing them yourself and living in accordance to them, right? It's like much more subtle, right? And that's a big part of the coaching as well, which is allowing people to find that, to find their own emotional boundaries and to actually have them. And at the start, people think it's like, oh, but how am I going to enforce them? It's like, it's not something you enforce. Like right now, we have emotional boundaries with each other. Like so much so that if you were to say a certain thing to me, I'd be like, bro, what are you saying? And the same thing to you, right? That can be different for everyone. But we don't have to like go through the checklist to find out what that is. There's like a mutual energetic understanding between us right now. And like this is what we're talking about. If we go into like something else, but I don't know what that would be. I can't even think of it right now. That would not be okay, right? It's almost like having you know, there's that felt sense of having that thing there. It's like having that with everything. With this person projecting at me, so I don't take on an interjection. With this person having this directed at me, you know, all that kind of stuff, basically. Is that making sense?
Mm. Yeah, that makes
Yeah,
sense. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I love how
you
you
know,
put it. It's very
yeah.
beautiful.
Thank you.
So for the listeners, how can they get in touch with you, Aaron?
Well, I'll give you my Facebook profile.
Yep.
Um, and they can do that. Yeah. And then they can message me through Facebook. I'm very open, and that's pretty much it.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Love chatting and
Thank you, sir.
can't wait to talk next time.
Yes, sir.